All right, thanks for joining. Before we get started, some basic housekeeping items. So first, this is being recorded and will be available and shared with you in a few days. And second, all attendees are on mute for today's Q&A, but we do want this to be as interactive as possible. So at any time, feel free to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All right, welcome again to our audience. So let's kick things off with some brief introductions. I am Jill Meuzelaar. I am on the product marketing team here at Amperity, and I'm joined today by Marcus Owens. Marcus is a pre-sales solution consultant here at Amperity. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, Marcus.
Hey, Jill, I'm really excited to be here today. Yeah, I've been with Amperity a little over a year now, and I've been in the MarTech ads tech space for about 7 years, and really excited to kind of go through, why I'm here at Amperity, and also talk a little bit about, what we've seen as kind of CDPs have evolved over these years. I started in the MarTech industry over at Oracle with BlueKai, so started on the DMP side of things, also traveled through more of the traditional CX, marketing stack, and then now really at what I think is the nexus of doing some exciting things with first-party data. So excited to talk today.
Yeah, same. I'm excited to have this conversation today. For those of you who are tuned in and are not familiar with Amperity, we are in the customer data platform space. We work with over 400 leading brands such as T-Mobile, Alaska Airlines, Dick's Sporting Goods, Planet Fitness, so many more. And we're here to talk today about what we're seeing and why we want to break down the fundamentals of a unified customer view. So that being said, I'm going to dig in with some questions. So first, Marcus, again, excited to talk about this topic today. You've been in this space, customer data and customer experiences for a long time and have really in-depth knowledge on some of the B2C brands and the different solutions they're trying to use to solve their customer data challenges. Tell us more about how you've seen that evolve.
Yeah. So, when I came into the space, obviously on the DMP side of things, there was this big focus on third-party data and how can we use these signals that we're getting from all over the place to better understand our customer. And, I think what was really driving that is businesses weren't in a place where they had access to their own data, rich data, especially about a customer. And as we saw a lot of things in the market change, right, the drive towards more personalization, the slow erosion of both the value and kind of the desire to use third-party data as it becomes less popular with our customers, we've seen the emergence of first-party data. And with that comes a lot of challenges in terms of how do we unify that data? How do we derive identity throughout that data? And how do we add value to that data and do stuff with it that actually recognizes our customer as who they are and respects kind of the emotional attachment they've got with our brand?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of starting to call it out, but like just starting with basics, I think customers today have higher expectations than ever before. And as consumers ourselves, we know that they've got all this information, yet they sometimes act as if they've never met us.
Yep.
Just this week, I've gotten a mailer from my national bank that was telling me about a branch movement in a city that I left 18 months ago. Presumably my bank knows that I moved. And I've got a meal delivery service that I've used for years that's sending me new customer offers. Why do these things keep happening?
Yeah, why is this still happening? I mean, that's a really good question, right? I think we're reaching a point, especially with the use of our customer data, that brands are realizing that just moving data quickly isn't enough, right? Both of those examples are probably a net out of the result of an effort of somebody to, try to communicate with you as quickly and as relevantly as possible. But what we're finding out is that if you're not doing that from the right notion of who that customer is, of who Jill is, you're going to do something like sending them information about a place they don't live anymore. I want my bank to know that I used to be there, but I especially expect them to know where I'm transacting, where I'm actually physically going into a branch now, right? So we've got to really solve that fundamental challenge of unifying those customer profiles. And at this point, we're kind of reaching a point where we're realizing a lot of the ways we've tried to do that have failed, right? And I think what it comes down to, for me, is we're trying to do all of this with computers, and we're working with human data, and humans are sort of inherently messy. So we've got to find a way to make the two meet in the middle in a way that really lets us, derive that strategic value we want from this base of customer data that we have. And what we're finding out, and this is sort of the worst part for the brands that are trying to solve this, is that the people with the messiest data are by and large your most valuable customers. And that sort of stands to reason, right? You know, Jill, if you've been with that bank for 10 years, of course you're a valuable customer, but they probably have some pretty messy data associated with you. You know, if you've been on that meal subscription service for a few years and maybe across a couple different places, and I don't know, maybe one time signed up with your work email so you could get that second promotion, right? How do they pull all that together so they understand who Jill is and, you know, how she's gaming the system maybe to make sure that they're speaking to you in the way you expect to be communicated with based upon your history with them?
Yeah, that's pretty scary. The you know, most transactions probably means those are the, you know, highest lifetime value customers also. I think it's interesting too that the concept of single source of truth or golden customer record, that concept's been around a really long time, and companies have invested all kinds of tools throwing that against the problem. And I'm sure anyone who's listening in today probably has the same question. How is a CDP going to be any different? There's been a market explosion around CDP, and I see, you know, product marketing here at Amperity, we're always trying to figure out how to differentiate ourselves. There's a lot of language around the unified customer profile. How is it different today from how it's been in the past?
Yeah, I mean, golden record, single source of truth, that's nothing new, right? We've been chasing that since, you know, the first time we put customer data on in a database. But what we're finding is that while we want to get to that single core source of truth and the golden record, there's a lot of challenges with making it accurate in the first place. And a lot of times we're finding that, and we'll talk about this a little more later, while you do need that golden customer record, it needs to be flexible enough that it can be used in a lot of different ways across the business. So let's talk first about the actual record itself, the customer profile. And the first thing I mentioned was accurate. And just a moment ago, I said, you know, people are messy, right? They move, they get married, they change their name, they use multiple email addresses, whether that's sometimes I transact with my Amperity address and sometimes I transact with my Gmail address, or whether I do that intentionally. You know, we make typos, we're talking to people at a point of sale and they put data in wrong, right? So all of these things are really stacking the deck against us when we're trying to actually build that coherent picture of Marcus or Jill within our data asset, and so we can understand them and we can actually communicate with them correctly. So we've tried as an industry to fix this in a lot of different ways, right? You know, we tried matching across a common identifier. We've tried, you know, getting into some rules-based matching. We've tried third-party identity graphs, kind of my old world, right? And in addition to that, you know, the degradation of that third-party cookie, not just the identity graphs, but also all the behavioral data that we used to rely on, is making this first-party data so much more important for the brands that we talk to every day. So we've got to come up with a solution to get us to an accurate foundation so we know that we're deriving the right insights when we run analytics, that we're giving the right experience when we go to customer service, that we're understanding the customer and communicating with them appropriately when we personalize content. So the next piece of that, though, is this can't really happen in a dark room. Right? When you're bringing this data together, you've got to be able to kind of crack open, you know, the engine and see what's going on inside. Right? A lot of the ID resolution motion over the past few years has been some form of send data, wait, get data. And there's something special, some sort of magic going on in the middle there, but we're not really privy to it as a brand. And so how do I maintain and increase the trust that I have in what's going on within that process and what's actually happening to pull together all of that transactional and that behavioral data that we need to build that full profile? And you should be able to look, right? You want that process to be transparent, but you also want a process that's not going to require a lot of manual intervention on a regular basis, right? So you should be able to look, but you shouldn't have to touch, right? And so ideally something that's going to be automated, that's going to be sort of self-healing, that's going to be able to kind of identify when you might have issues, as opposed to you being in a situation where you're manually doing a lot of data stewardship. And finally, it needs to be comprehensive. So it's not just about Marcus Owens, marcus.owens@amperity.com, and all of those pieces of contact and identifiable information. It's about all of the information about my interactions with your brand over time. And I don't just mean interactions on the website or email campaigns. I mean, when I made a purchase at your store 8 years ago, when I lived in college at a different address with a different phone number, how do I make sure that I connect that to what you're doing today so I actually understand you and your complete customer journey as a consumer of my brand?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So to recap, strong identity resolution solution to ensure you've got accuracy. The second is some transparency about how those records are connected. And the last being comprehensive unification of all of the customer data systems. It seems like that would be fantastic to have if I was running marketing for a brand, but how does that work? I've got a ton of other tools. How do you take that data and make sure that it works with all of those other tools?
Right, right. I mean, the customer profile is sort of the beating heart of the CDP and probably your whole MarTech stack, but it's not everything. All right. And the first thing, and notably what I haven't talked about yet, is one of the most important things. And that is, how do I actually get the data into the system, whatever I choose, so that I can build that customer profile in the first place. Right. And one of the common things we hear when we talk to marketers is, I've got a bunch of data I want to use, but I can't get it together for XYZ reason, right? It's in a schema that's not compatible with the system that I'm using. Or maybe it's just as simple as, I've got to call IT and they put it into a Jira queue, and then 2 weeks later the data pops out, and I was trying to run a campaign for Halloween and now it's Thanksgiving, right? So maybe it's that simple. So you need a solution that's not only going to make it so that you can have access to every single one of the sources you want to build that customer profile, but also give you that access in a way that it's going to be, a real light lift on your team, that it's going to make it accessible, and it's not going to penalize you for wanting to kind of enrich that profile of the customer with all these different first party data assets you have, right? Whether that's something that's, digital native and in a really nice clean data format, or whether that's, your old mainframe that's drywalled in somewhere down at Baton Rouge, and the guy that knows how to export data from it left the company 10 years ago, right? We want to be able to capture as much of that data as possible. So getting the data in, building that profile, that's still not enough, right? We've got to make that data usable, right? We can't, once we bring it all together, if we can't combine it into a coherent, usable view of the customer, we can't do anything with it. And beyond that, and I've alluded to this before, we'll talk more about it in future sessions, we've got to make sure that we're supporting every part of the business and their different needs with a specific customer view that's relevant for them. So while that means that we need to have that golden customer record, we also need to have the flexibility to sort of give slices of that customer record to our analytics team that doesn't want to see PII or can't handle PII, and our customer service team, which needs a rich understanding of all this person's interactions with our brand, and our paid media campaign, which needs every email they may have possibly ever interacted with us across, because we also want to capture that Facebook account they started 10 years ago with their college email, right? Because that's what they still use today.
Yeah.
Right. So once we've done all this, we've made this data usable, made it accessible to everybody, we've got to make the data better, right? You need to find a CDP that's going to give you off the shelf value add to your data. So whether that's as simple as calculating that lifetime value now that we've pulled all this together, or whether that's getting more complex, such as identifying their preferred store and getting into predictive, and how do we test that predictive and make sure that it's accurate and actually trained on real historical transactional behavior as opposed to just clicks, right? And I want to know what my customer's doing with their mouse, but I really care what they're going to do with their wallet. And then finally, and you note that I've talked about getting the data in, then we make the data usable, then we make the data better, and only then should you use the data. Right now, you've got this robust, awesome data asset, and you've got to have a CDP that's able to disseminate it to all those places I mentioned before, but also to seamlessly connect to that stack the same way that it brings data in, right? So that you don't have to worry about, well, I'd love to send this data to this particular destination, but I'm not able to configure it in the right way, or I'm not able to manage it in the right cadence, things of that nature. So you needed to be connected into that stack, but also not to lock you in to any sort of other part of your stack, right? So in a build versus buy conversation, right, you need a CDP that's going to be flexible enough to sort of fit in the middle of both. So as you want to explore different partners from a loyalty perspective or from a customer service perspective, you have the flexibility to do that in a platform that makes it easy for you and reduces the cost of a transition and implementation.
Right.
That was a lot, I know.
But you're putting them in lists, so it's easy for me to recap. Okay, so first, centralize the data, even if it's in Baton Rouge. Such a great example. Second, make that data usable to all kinds of end users. And then add the turnkey elements, things that are baked in, anticipate what the end users might expect. And then last, actionable to the tools that you already have in place, and future-proof, actionable to future tools that might not even exist today, right?
Exactly.
All right, I'm going to ask you one more question before we open it up to the audience.
Sounds good.
So what does life look like if you are become a marketer with access to this unified customer view? Maybe I said marketer, if you've got other examples. What does life look like to an organization with a unified customer view?
Well, I can imagine a lot of things, right? But and so far I've been trying to speak about things generally, but obviously my experience here comes a lot from working with and hearing some of our customer stories here at Imparities. So, a couple that stood out. One, that really to me brings home the entire value of bringing this data together is Wyndham, one of our customers that were under the impression they had an issue with unidentified guests basically that weren't members of their loyalty program staying with them. And prior to working with us, their goal really was to find out how they could get those guests into their loyalty program. Well, once they brought their data into the platform, ran that sort of identity resolution that I advocate for, they were actually able to identify the majority of those guests, upwards of 70% of them, were actually already members of the loyalty program. And they were, for one reason or another, executing a stay that wasn't associated with their number, right? Maybe they booked at OTA or something along those lines. So what a marketer's life looks like with that information is now you have the power to not just know that, but take action based on it and target those people and say, did you know you're leaving points on the table by booking with a website as opposed to booking directly with us? Did you know that you have these benefits waiting for you? All these different things. Super exciting story. And I travel a lot, so I always love to hear those sort of stories. Second one, this is another one in the travel realm. And this is a customer that wanted to really enhance what they were doing in terms of personalizing some of their email content, specifically focused on upgrades and adding packages and whatnot. And they're seeing about a 30% uptick in the revenue from the same campaign year over year with a unified customer profile and all this rich data versus what they were doing last year with one of the large marketing clouds. So I think that's really exciting when we see, I love the loyalty numbers, but every marketer really wants to see that actual revenue improvement and be able to tie it directly to a campaign. And oh, by the way, we didn't get deep into this, but there's so much that you want your CDP to do in terms of how you're actually measuring and optimizing the campaigns you're putting out into the wild. And so you want a CDP that's going to be able to understand that conversion event, no matter where it happens, online, offline, what have you. And then finally, one of the more exciting stories I think about what we're doing with some customers are seeing a lot of gains in using their first party data to really supercharge what they're doing in paid media. So we've had one customer that saw, and there's a wild number to me, I had to go dig into the numbers to believe it, but a 3,000% increase in match rate sending audiences to TikTok. And of course, as you can imagine, resultant increases in the success of those campaigns. We're seeing more and more people exploring what signals do I have within my own data, so I don't maybe need to leverage as many third-party partners. I can go more directly to these paid media markets and leverage the data that I've got and really just increase my return on ad spend by decreasing the cost in the first place.
Yeah, very cool. That's a pretty diverse set of experiences. And I love hearing from I agree with you. I love hearing from our client service teams and the brands that work with us on all the interesting use cases that they come up with. Let's go ahead and open it up to the audience and see what other questions there might be out there. All right. Oh, here's a good one to start with. All right, we get this a lot. So yeah. I'm pretty sure I already have a unified customer view in some of my other tools. Can you help me understand how this might be different?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say first and foremost, I would say probably most marketing vendors are going to talk about the fact that they have the best unified customer view. And I think what I've really kind of focused on as we talk today is you need to centralize that in a place and in a manner that you can both trust it, but also make it flexible and usable, for everyone, right? So when I say, I already have a custom unified, when I hear customers say I already have a unified customer view, usually the next sentence is, but the problem is I have about a dozen of them, right? So you need to bring those dozen unified customer views together with a solution that's able to match them in the way that you weren't able to before, that created those dozen different views, right? So lots more to that. I could talk for hours, and I promise I won't. But that's kind of my take on that one.
We'll make sure attendees have a way to reach you directly after this if they want to
Good.
dig in, talk for
Good
hours
deal.
about it. All right, we've got another one, a little bit about the tools we were talking about, but so a few questions on this. Where does the CDP fit into a MarTech stack? And maybe specifically, how is a CDP different from a DMP or an ESP? Well, those are very different. So
Yeah, very different things, right?
maybe define those also as you.
Yeah. Well, I think it kind of speaks to the fact that the CDP kind of needs to be able to work with all sorts of different tools that have very different notions of customers and customer identity and customer interactions, right? So we talk about, just to define them real quick, DMP, data management platform, kind of maybe a less popular category these days, but in the heyday of third-party data, this was where you really leverage your usually website data combined with some third-party data to build out your paid media audiences, right? And when it comes to a DMP and CDP, oftentimes it's a better together story, right? Because the core of what people are doing in a DMP still comes back to first-party data. So if we can bring that rich, full view of the customer together from a first-party standpoint and enhance what we're doing on that side, maybe we can reduce the reliance on third-party data that you had in your DMP and is maybe kind of eroding in value or availability. On the ESP side, right, an email service provider, right? So your the Brazes, the Klaviyo's, the came from Oracle, so the Responses of the world. Those are really powerful platforms that are rich in their ability to orchestrate like an email and SMS type interaction experience. But what we need to do with the CDP is sort of enable those platforms to do what they do best and focus on using the CDP as the place to generate those rich attributes and segments that are going to then determine the experience that happens in that ESP. And the reason for that is, those platforms, they don't want 10 years of raw transaction data, right? They're not built to process that, to aggregate that into meaningful attributes. Let the CDP do that, and then drive those campaigns with that better understanding of the customer that you expect from a personalization standpoint.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense. Going back to that checklist you kind of provided earlier.
Yeah.
I see one more question here that I think you kind of just answered with DMP, and then I think your TikTok story above also covers it, but can a CDP take over from a DMP?
That's a big question. I don't want to make any. I don't want to make any enemies in my past experience here. So, can a CDP take over for a DMP? I think we're seeing in a lot of ways it's already starting to. I think we're seeing in a lot of ways it's also a better together story to the extent that DMPs maintain their utility for now. But I don't want to pigeonhole the CDP in that space, right? Your CDP should be so much more. While this is probably the most exciting new thing that people are talking about CDPs for, right? Driving that paid media with a rich first party asset that you own instead of pay somebody else for. There's so much more that your CDP could and should do beyond this. And it's really about that CDP becoming the core of a consistent, connected customer experience, whether I'm experiencing your brand in person, via clienteling, online, via your website or paid media, in email, on the phone, etc., as that focal point for that complete view of who Marcus is, who Jill is. So every time I have an interaction with your brand, I feel like you understand who I am, because that's what people expect now.
That'd be great. No more letters telling me about a branch that's 2,000 miles away moving down the street. Well, that is it from audience questions. So I think we can go ahead and wrap things up here. Thanks everyone for joining. And as we said, a recording will go out in a few days. And of course, any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Give me a call.
Thanks.